Dernis Taganin wed Khal Drago with fear and barbaric splendor. In the field beyond the walls of Pentos, for the Dathrog believed that all things of importance in a man's life must be done beneath an open sky. Dragon called for his Khalzar to attend him, and they had come. 40,000 Dathrog warriors, uncounted numbers of women, children, and slaves. Outside the city walls of the campus, they camped with their vast herds, rising palaces of woven grass, eating everything in sight. They marked the good folk of Pentos more Anuix with every passing day. My fellow Magistas have doubled the size of the city guard, Ilroy told them over platters of honey duck and orange-snapped peppers one night at the mayonnaise of that had been Drago's. The Calhan had joined his Khalzar. His estate had given over Dernis and her brother until the wedding. Best we get Princess Dernis wedded quick before the hand of the wealth of Pentos away to sell swords and bravos. Sir John Mormont jested. An exile had offered her brother his sword. The night Danny had sold the Calhoun Dragon. Verses had accepted eagerly. Mormont had been their consistent companion ever since. Magister Ilroy laughed lightly through his forked beard. But Verses did not so much as smile. He can have her tomorrow if he likes, her brother said. He glanced over at Danny, and she lowered her eyes. So long as he pays the price. Elroy waved a long, Lugan hand in the air. Rings glittered on his fat fingers. I've told you all is settled. Trust me. The Calhoun has promised you a crown. You shall have it. Yes, but when the Calhoun chooses, Elroy said, he will have the girl first, and after they wed, they must make his procession across the plains and present her to Dosh Calhoun at Vase Dathrok. After that, perhaps, if omens favor war. Verses seethed with impatience. I pissed on Dathrok omens. The Esperates sits on my father's throne. How long must I wait? Ilroy gave a massive shrug. You have waited most of your life, great king. What is another few months? Another few years? Sir Drothran, who had travelled as far as east as Vest Dathrok, nodded in agreement. I counsel you to be patient, your grace. The Dathrok are true to their word, but they do things in their own time. A lesser man may beg a favor from Cal, but must never presume to betray him. Reeses bristled. Guard your tongue, Mormont, or I'll have it out. I am no lesser man. I am the rightful lord of the seven kingdoms. The dragon does not beg. Sir Jorah lowered his eyes respectfully. Ilroy smiled benignantly and tore a wing from the dug. Honey and grease over his fingers and dripped down into his beard as he nibbled the tender meat. There are no more dragons, Danny thought, staring at her brother, though did she not dare to say it aloud. Yet the night she dreamt of one. Verses was hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her brother seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. You woke the dragon, he screamed and kicked her. You woke the dragon. Her thighs were slick with blood. She closed her eyes and whimpered, as if in answer. There was a hideous ripping sound of the crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Verses was gone. Great columns of flame rose around, and in the mist of them was a dragon. It turned its great head slowly. When her molten eyes found her, she awoke, shaken and covering her, covering with fine sheen of sweat. She had never been so afraid, until the day her wedding came at last. The ceremony had begun at dawn and continued until dusk. An endless day of drinking and feasting and fighting. A mighty earthy ramp had been raised amid the grass palace, and there Dany was seated beside Calhoun Drago. Above the seething sea of Deathrock, she had never seen so many people in one place, nor people so strange and frightening. The horse lords might put on rich fabrics and sweet perfumes, but when they visited the free cities, but out under the open skies they kept the old ways. Men and women alike wore painted leather vests over bare chests and horsehair leggings clutched by bronze medallion belts. And the warriors greased their long braids with fat and rendering pits. They gorged themselves on horseflesh, roasting with honey and peppers, drank themselves blind on fermented Mere's milk and Ilroy's fine wines, spat-chested at each other of the fires, their voices harsh and alien in Dany's ears. Verces was seated just below her, splendid in a new black wool tunic with a scarlet dragon on his chest. Ilroy and Jara sat beside him. There was a place in the high honor, just below the Cal's own blood riders, but Dany could see the anger in her brother's metallic eyes. He did not like sitting beneath her. He was fumed when the slaves offered each dish first to the Calhoun and his prize, and served him for the portions they refused. He could do nothing but nurse his resentment, so nurse it he did, his mood grown blacker by the hour at each insult to his person. Dany never felt so alone as she did seated in the midst of the vast horde. Her brother had told her to smile, and so she smiled until her face ached, and the tears came unbidden to her eyes. She did her best to hide them, knowing how angry Verces would be if he saw her crying, terrified of how Calhoun Dragoon might react. Food was brought to her, steaming of joints of meat and thick black sausages, and the dark Deathrock's blood pies, and later fruits and sweet grass stews, and delicate pastries from the kitchens of Pantos. She waved it all away. Her stomach was roiled, and she knew that she could keep none of it down. There was no one to talk to. Calhoun Dragon shouted commands and gests down to his blood riders and laughed in their replies, but he scarcely glanced at Dany beside him. They had no common language. Deathrock was incomprehensible to her, and Calhoun knew only a few words of bastard Valerie of the free cities, and none at all of the common tongue of the Seven Kingdoms. She would even hear the welcomed of the conversations of Ilroy and her brother, but they were too far below to hear her. So she sat in her wedding silks, nursing a cup of honey wine, afraid to eat, talking silently to herself. "I am the blood of the dragon," she told herself. "I am Dany Stormborn, princess of Dragonstone, of blood of the sea of the Aegon of the Conqueror." The sun was only a quarter way up the sky when she saw her first man die. Drums were beating as some of the women danced on Fort Calhoun. Drago watched without expectations, but his eyes followed their movements, and from time to time he would toss down a bronze medallion for the women to fight over. The warriors watched too. One of them finally stepped into the circle, grabbing a dancer by the arm, pushed her down on the ground, and mounted her right there, as a stallion mounts a mare. Ilroy had told her that might happen. The Deathrags mate like animals in their herds. There is no privacy in the Khalasar, and they do not understand sin or shame as we do. Dany looked away from the Kubeline, frightened when she realized what was happening, but the second warrior stepped forward, and a third, and soon there was no way to avert her eyes. Then 2 men seized the same woman. She heard a shout, saw a shove, and in a blink of an eye the arcs were out, long razor-sharp blades, half sword, half scythe. A dance of death began. The warriors circled and slashed, leaping towards each other, whirling the blades. around their heads, shrieking insults at each clash. No one made a movement to interfere. It ended quickly as it began. The Arthrox shivered together faster than Danny could follow, and one man missed a step, and the other swung his blade in a flat arc. Steel bit into flesh just above Deathstroke's waist, and opened him from the backbone to the belly button, spilling his entrails on the dust. As the loser died, the winner took hold of the nearest woman, not even the one they had been quarreling over, and had her there and then. Slaves carried off the body, and the dancing resumed. Magister Ilroy had warned Danny about this too. A Dathrox wedding without at least 3 deaths is deemed a direful affair, he had told her. Her wedding must have been especially bliss. Before the day was over, a dozen men had died. As the hour passed, the terror grew in Danny until it all was could she do until it was all she could do not to scream. She was afraid of Deathrock, whose ways seemed alien and monstrous, as if they were beasts in human skin and not true men at all. She was afraid of her brother, of what he might do if she failed him. Most of all, she was afraid of what could happen tonight under the stars, when her brother gave up her to the hulking giant who sat drinking beside her, with his face as still and cruel as a bronze mask. On the blood of the dragon she held herself again. When at last the sun was lowered in the sky, Calhoun clapped his hands together, and the drums and shouting and the feasting come to a sudden halt. Dragoon stood and pulled Danny to her feet beside him. It was time for her bride gifts. And after the gifts, she knew, after the sun had gone down, it would be the time of the first ride and the consummation of her marriage. Danny tried to put thought aside, but it would not leave her. She hugged herself, trying to keep from shaking. Her brother Verces gifted her with 3 handmaids. Danny knew that they had cost nothing to him. Ilroy, no doubt, had provided the girls. Iri and Jack Louis were copper-skinned Dathrock with black hair and almond-shaped eyes. Dora, a fair-haired and blue-eyed Lenser girl. There are no common servants, sweet sister, her brother had told her as they were brought forward. One by one, Ilroy and I selected them personally for you. Iri will teach you writing, Jacqueline the Darthrock tongue, and Derry will instruct you in the womanly arts of love. He smiled thinly. She's very good, Ilroy. I can both swear to that. Sarah Jera Mormont apologized for his gift. It is a small thing, my princess, but it is all a poor exile could afford. As he laid a small stack of old books before her, there were histories and songs of the 7 kingdoms she saw written in the common tongue. She thanked him with all her heart. Magister Ilroy murmured a command, and 4 burly slaves hurried forward, bearing between them a great cedar chest bound in bronze. When she opened it, she found a pile of the finest velvets and damasks the free cities could produce, and resting on top, nestled in a soft cloth, 3 huge eggs. Danny gasped. They were the most beautiful things she has ever seen, each different than the other, patterned in such rich colors that at first she thought they were crusted with jewels, and so large it took both of her hands to hold one. She lifted it delicately, expecting that it would be made of some fine proclin or delicate enamel, or even blown glass, but it was much heavier than that, as if they were all solid stone. The surface of the shell was covered with tiny scales, and she had turned the eggs between her fingers. They shimmered like polished metal in the light of the setting sun. One egg was deep green with burnished bronze flakes that came and went depending on how Danny turned it. Another pale cream streak of gold, and last was black as midnight sea, yet alive with the scarlet ripples and swirls. What were they? She asked, her voice hushed and full of wonder. Dragon eggs, from the shadow lands of beyond Ashia, said Magister Ilroy. The eons have turned them to stone, yet they still burn bright with beauty. I shall treasure them always. Danny had heard tales such eggs, but she had never seen one, nor she thought that she to see one. It was truly magnificent gift, though she knew that Ilroy could afford to be lavished. He had collected a fortune of horses and slaves for his part in selling her Calhoun Drago. The Calhoun's blood riders offered her additional 3 weapons, and splendid weapons they were. Halgor gave her a great leather whip with a silver handle, Callio a magnificent arquebus chested in gold, and Quaithio a double-carved dragon-bone bow taller than she was. Magister and Sir Jara had taught her the traditional refusal of these offerings. This is a gift worthy of a great warrior. O blood of my blood, and I am but a woman. Let my lord husband bear these in my stead. And Khal Drogo too received his bride gifts. Other gifts were given her, plenty by Dathrox, slippers and jewels and silver rings in her hair, and medallion belts, and painted vests, and soft furs, and sand silk, and jars of scents, needles and feathers, and tiny bottles of purple glass, and a gown made from the silk of 1,000 mice. A handsome gift, Calis. Magister Ilroy said of the last, after he had told her what it was. Most luckily, the gifts mounted up around her in a great pile, more gifts than she could possibly imagine, more gifts than she could ever want or use. At the last of all, Calhoun Drago brought forth his own bride gift to her. An unexpected hush rippled out from the center of the camp as he left her side, growing until it had swallowed the whole Khalzar. When he returned, a dense press of Dathrock gift-givers parted before him, and the led a horse through. She was a young filly. Spirited and splendid, Danny knew just enough about horses to know that this was no ordinary animal. There was something about her that took her breath away. She was as grey as winter sea, with a mane like silver smoke. Hesitant, she reached out and stroked the horse's neck. She ran her fingers through the silver upper mane. Calhoun Drago said something in Dathrock, and Magister Ilroy translated. "Silver for silver of your hair," the Khal says. "She's beautiful," Demi murmured. "She is a pride of the Khalzar," Ilroy said. "Accustomed to crease, the Khalzar must ride a mount worthy of her place by the side of Cal. Drago stepped forward to put his hands on her waist. He lifted her up easily, as if she was a child, and he sent her on a thin Dathrock saddle, so much smaller than the ones she was used to. Danny sat there uncertain for a moment. No one had told her about this part. "What should I do?" she asked Ilroy. It was Sir Jaro and Mormont who answered. "Take the reins and ride it. You need not to go far." Nervously, Danny gathered the reins in her hands and slid her feet onto the short stirrups. She was only a fair rider. She had spent far more time traveling by ship and wagon and palanquin than by horseback. Praying that she would not fall off or disgrace herself, she gave a fully and the lightest, most intimate touch to her knees. For the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid, or perhaps it was the first time ever. This silver-grey filly moved with a smooth and silken gait, and a coward parted for her. Every eye upon them, Danny found herself moving faster as she did intended. Yet somehow it was exciting rather than terrifying. The horse broke into a trot, and she smiled. Dathrock scrambled to clear the path, the slightest pressure on their legs, and the slightest touch of the reins. The filly responded. She sent it into a gallop, and now the Dathrock were hooting and laughing and shouting at her as they were jumped out of the way. As she turned to ride back, the fire pit loomed overhead, directly in her path. They were hemmed on either side, with no room to stop. A daring she had never known filled Dernies then, and she gave a fully pat on her head. The silver horse leaped leaped the flames as if she had wings. When she pulled up before Magister Ilroy, she said, "Tell Calhoun Dragon that he has given me the wind." The flat Pantush stroked his yellow beard as he repeated the words in Dathrock, and Danny saw her new husband smiled for the first time. The last silver of the sun vanished behind the walls of Pentos to west just then. Danny had lost all track of time. Calhoun Dragon commanded the flood riders to bring forth his own horse, Tulane Red Stallion. As the Calhoun was saddled the horse, Verses slid close to Danny on her silver, dug his fingers into her leg, and said, Please him, sweet sister, or I swear you will see the dragon awake as it has never woken before." The fear came back to her then. With her brother's words, she felt like the child once more, only 13 and all alone, not ready for what was about to happen to her. They rode out together as the stars came out, leaving Calzar and the grass palace behind. Cal Drago spoke no words to her, but drove his stallion as hard as the trot behind the gathering dusk. And tiny silver bells in his long braid rang softly as he rode. "I am the blood of the dragon," she whispered aloud as she followed him, trying to keep her courage up. "I am the blood of the dragon. I am the blood of the dragon." The dragon was never afraid. Afterwards she could not say how far or how long they had been ridden, but it was full dark when they stopped at the grassy palace beside a small stream. Drago swung off his horse and lifted her down from hers. She felt as fragile as glass in his hands. Her limbs were weak as water. She stood there hopelessly and trembling in her wedding silks when he secured their horses, and when he turned to look at her, she began to cry. Calhoun Dragon stared at her tears, his face strangely empty of expression. "No," he said. He lifted his hands and rubbed away the tears roughly with the Kalyu's thumb. "You speak a common tongue," Danny said in wonder. "No," he said again. Perhaps he had only that word, she thought. But there was one more than she had known, and somehow it made her feel even a little better. Drago touched her hair lightly, sliding the silver blonde strands between his fingers, and murmured softly in Dathrock. Danny did not understand the words, yet there was warmth in the tone, and tenderness she had never expected from this man. He put his fingers under her chin and lifted her head. So she was looking up into his eyes. Drago towered over her as he towered over everyone, and taking her lightly under his arms. He lifted her seated on a rounded rock beside the stream. Then he sat on the ground facing her, legs crossed beneath him, their face finally at a height. "No," he said. "Is that the only word you know?" She asked him. Drago did not reply. His long, heavy braid was coiled in the dirt beside him. He pulled it over to his right shoulder and began to remove the bells from his hair, one by one. After a moment, Danny leaned over to help, and when they were done, Drago gestured. She understood. Slowly, carefully, she began to undo his braid. It took a long time. All the while, he sat there silently watching her. When she was done, he shook his head, and his hair spread out behind him like a river of darkness, oiled and clean. She had never seen hair so long, so black, so thick. Then it was his turn, and began to undress her. Her fingers were deft and strangely tender. He removed her silk one by one, carefully, while Danny sat unmoving, silently looking at his eyes. When they bare a small breast, she could not help herself. She averted her eyes, and covered herself with her hands. "No, no," Drago said. He pulled her hands away from her breast gently, but firmly, then lifted her face again to make her look at him. "No," he repeated. "No," she echoed back at him. He stood there and then pulled her close to remove the last of her silks. The night air was chilly, under bare skin. She shivered and goose flesh covered her arms and legs. She was afraid that what would come next. But for a while nothing happened. Calhoun sat with his legs crossed, looking at her, drinking in her body with his eyes. After a while he began to touch her lightly at first and then harder. She could sense a fierce strength in his hands, but he never hurt her. He held her hand in his own and brushed her fingers. One by one he ran a hand gently down her leg. He stroked her face, tracing the curve of her ear, running a finger gently around her mouth. He put both hands in her hair and combed it with his fingers. He turned around, massaged her shoulders, so that knuckled down the path of her spine. It seemed as if hours had passed before his hands finally went down to her breasts. He stroked the soft skin underneath until it tangled. He circled her nipples with his thumbs, pinched them between the thumbs and forefingers, then began to pull her, very lightly at first, then more intensely until her nipples stiffened and began to ache. He stopped then and drew her down to his lap. Danny was flushed and breathless. Her heart fluttered in her chest. He cupped her face with his huge hands and looked into his eyes. "No," he said, and she knew it was a question. She took his hands and moved it down to her wetness between her thighs. "Yes," she whispered, and put his fingers inside her.